podcast you're about to hear is true. The names have not been changed to protect the innocent, the guilty, or anyone else. If you're interested in the same type of discussion related to organized crime that you hear in the traditional media, stop listening now. If you're interested in thinking differently or learning something, turn up the volume on your computer, smartphone, or mobile device. This is The Racket Report. Here's Frank Morano.
This is The Racket Report, the podcast that tries to take you inside the world of organized crime. When we talk about organized crime in the 20th and 21st century, I don't know that there's a more interesting figure than James Whitey Bulger. For starters, he was purportedly running one of the most notorious organized criminal families or gangs in the Northeast. Then the rumors were that while he was doing that, he was actually working as an FBI informant. If that wasn't interesting enough, just so happened that his brother was one of the most powerful politicians in Massachusetts during the time that he was one of the most powerful criminals in Massachusetts. If that wasn't interesting enough, when he evades capture and goes on the lam, he's one of, after Osama bin Laden dies, the most wanted people in the country, maybe even the world. And then you don't even want to get started with the circumstances of his death, which the more we learn about it, seems even more suspicious. Someone who has been involved in the Whitey Bulger case from many different perspectives for the last 11 years has been Janet Uhlar. Janet Uhlar is an author, a screenwriter, a master storyteller, but she also happened to serve as a juror on James Whitey Bulger's trial, and then after the trial began a 5-year correspondence with him. She's also the author of a book called Truth Be Damned, which deals a bit with the Bulger case. And since Whitey's passing, she's been very, very vocal, very, very outspoken in terms of something being amiss, not only with respect to his trial, but with respect to his death. Very, very pleased to welcome to the Racket Report, Janet Uhlar. Janet, it's great to talk to you.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Janet, before you ended up serving as a juror in the Bulger case, what was your level of familiarity with Mr. Bulger, his crime, his life?
Absolutely nothing. I was a blank slate. I knew the name, and I knew he was allegedly the head of the Irish mob in South Boston.
So a lot of folks wonder how you get picked for a high-profile case like the one you were on. I would think the fact that you didn't have preconceived notions about his guilt or innocence, didn't know much about him by your own admission, I think that would probably help in terms of both sides finding you an acceptable juror.
It seems that it did, but there were other jurors that, had known quite a bit about him. So, yeah, I'm sure they appreciated it. But I will say that in the jury pool, when we had to fill out our questionnaire, I did put down that I wrote 2 books on the American Revolution, just so they would know that I had written these books, and maybe they wouldn't want me on that jury because I might write a book, but it didn't work.
What were you trying to get out of it?
I think everybody was trying to get out of it in a sense. This was kind of a scary, situation, even for us going into it, because we had no idea what kind of protection or whatever, and we were not protected at all. We were sent home every day. So, yeah, it was frightening. It was life-changing. So the nature of your apprehension about being on the jury, it didn't necessarily have to do with the length of time and it taking you away from your work or other things. You were potentially concerned because you're hearing a case involving violent crimes and you're not sequestered and getting that kind of protection. It was both. It was the length and it was that for certain. Mm-hmm.
All right. Were you were a writer, obviously. You just alluded to your books on the American Revolution. You were a writer before you even had anything to do with Whitey Bulger, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
All right. So you are a juror on the case. You obviously voted to convict. The verdict was unanimous. What was your key takeaways about the government's case and about how the defense handled the evidence that was presented at the trial? What did you think of the trial?
I think the trial was a well-oiled machine to bring forth what the government wanted to bring forth. For example, initially it was supposed to be a 4-month trial. We saw the list of witnesses for both the prosecution and defense, and this happened in the early jury pool, not just for the sitting jury. And the defense had a long list of witnesses, but when it came down to it, they only had a handful that came forward. Found out after it was because the judge determined she didn't want the trial to go much longer because she was, thinking about the jury. So supposedly said. And so she cut out a bunch of the witnesses for the defense. When we went, the way the RICO statutes are, when we went into deliberations, much of it was guilt by association. So if John Materano did something, Bulger's automatically guilty. The same with Steve Fleming. If Steve Fleming actually killed someone, Bulger is guilty of the murder. And when we were in deliberations, 5 members of the jury did not believe the key witnesses against Bulger were telling the truth. And that was huge. I mean, their main witnesses, it was felt by 5 members of the jury that these guys, 2 of them were headed for the electric chair. And none of them thought Bulger was going to get captured. And so they basically ultimately told the prosecuting attorneys anything they wanted to hear. And John Materano actually said in his testimony that Fred Wyshak, the prosecuting attorney, didn't just come to him once or twice. He came once and twice and said, "You're not giving me enough information." So Materano gave him more every time he came until he hit that magic number, and he was given an immoral deal that is just absolutely shocking. And when we took that all into account as the jury, we just couldn't, 5 of us could not believe that he was necessarily telling the truth, or Fleming.
How then did you go from a point where 5 didn't believe what the government was selling to a point where all 12 of you voted to convict?
We did not convict on 6 of the murders. I think it was 6, and then 1 was not proven because we just wouldn't accept this death by association in those particular murders because they were early on in the early 70s, and Bulger had not yet been established in that the Winter Hill Gang. So we felt that Materano, or enough of us felt that Materano was responsible for those murders and would not convict Bulger of those. The other ones, because it was years later, it was, some of them were absolutely guilt by association. Some of them weren't because we felt Bulger, or enough of us felt Bulger absolutely did it. There was division. But this whole guilt by association is what we had to give into in the end.
Was it a mistake through the prism of hindsight from a defense perspective for Bulger not to testify in that trial?
I don't think it maybe would have made too much of a difference. It wasn't televised. If the thing was televised, yeah, definitely he should have testified. But it wasn't televised. And the media after the trial, when I was able to read what was being printed, they left out so many things that were really important to have in the paper. So, no, with it not being televised, I don't know that it made any difference.
Give me an idea of something that the media left out that you, as a juror, had firsthand knowledge of.
Well, the case of Kevin O'Neill, for instance, he was one of the owners of the Triple O's bar in South Boston, and they were trying to get him to give information to incriminate Bulger. And Kevin O'Neill wouldn't. I mean, he said initially, I mean, his whole time as a witness, you could tell this guy just wanted to give yes and no answers. He was not playing into anything. And the long and short of it was this guy was arrested. He wouldn't give the information. They ended up telling him that convicting him of a murder of a woman that he said in testimony he never even heard of, let alone murdered. But they held this over him, kept him in prison for a year, then continued to threaten him with things like, we're going to sell the house out from under your young family, so they're going to be out in the street. His businesses were all deteriorating, and they're holding this murder thing over him. So finally, he gives them information that they're satisfied with, whether it's true or not true, they're going to use it. And all of a sudden, the prosecuting attorney, Brian Kelly, who was the one doing this to O'Neill while he was in prison, said, oh, yeah, and then we realized, oops, we were mistaken about the murder. And he kind of just shrugged his shoulders as if it was the most normal thing in the world. And I will tell you, Frank, I only sobbed while driving home 3 times during that 10 weeks, wow. And that was one of the days I sobbed.
Oof. I can imagine. Talk to me about the sweetheart deals that some of the government witnesses got in terms of their testimony for the government against Whitey Bulger. Were you turned off at all that these criminals, violent criminals, were getting off in some cases with a slap on the wrist because they were willing to tie Bulger to their crimes?
Oh, absolutely. That was the reason 5 of us wouldn't believe the testimony of the witnesses, partly because of these deals. They were immoral deals. I'll start with John Materano, and then I'll go on to John Morris, because these are the most shocking ones. John Materano admitted to murdering 20 people in cold blood, including 2 teenagers in the wrong place at the wrong time. He talked about these murders as though he was just pushing a fly off his arm, no big deal whatsoever. Lied about the teenagers, which with cross-examination came out clearly, that he put a bullet in each of their heads. And they weren't guilty of anything except being in the wrong place at the wrong time. So he ended up, even with 20 murders and all the federal crimes that he committed, okay? Let's not forget that these guys committed federal crimes also, and in this case, more murders than Bulger was being charged with, all right? And he ended up getting a deal where of serving 12 years for all of those crimes, which works out to less than 6 months for each of those murders, including the teenagers. Can you imagine being their parents? Then he had money put in his account the whole while he's in prison. I believe it was $6,000 by the government. And when he walked out of prison, he was handed something like $25,000 to start his life. He was allowed to write a book and make a profit off that book and never have to give any of that to his victims. His girlfriend, who was on the lam with him for 16 years, who was involved in actual money laundering and lied to a grand jury twice, never spent a day in prison. Wow. I mean, it was just outrageous. Then let's flip over to John Morris. This creep, he's the most despicable of them all in reality because he was supposed to be serving the public. This creep was taking bribes, he said, from 3 different organized crime figures. he would bring these guys home for dinner. I mean, that just puts a different spin on guess who's coming to dinner for his wife and family, right?
I don't mean to laugh, but it's funny the way you put it. By the way, if people don't know John Morris, he is the former FBI agent that was charged with corruption for his involvement with Whitey Bulger, Steve Flemmi, and the Winter Hill Gang. He was the direct supervisor of John Connolly, who's been depicted in all the movies and the books in terms of the marriage between the FBI and Whitey Bulger, just by way of background for folks.
Right. And so John Connolly's taking bribes, admitting he is. John Connolly is admitted in his testimony that he gave Bulger information about Brian Halloran that he knew was going to lead to the death of Brian Halloran. And it wasn't just Brian Halloran that ended up dead. It was an acquaintance of his by the name of Michael Donahue, who happened to be giving Halloran a ride home. So he admitted in the stand that he was an accessory in those murders. And it was the defense attorney who called him out on it and asked him if he had ever apologized to those families, the Hallorans or the Donahues. And he said, no, he had not. And Hank Brennan, the defense attorney, said, don't you think it's a good time to do it now? Oof. I mean, this man admitted to being an accessory in 2 murders, and his punishment? Nothing. He wasn't punished at all. He remained in the FBI. He retired out of Quantico, and he's living off his FBI pension now. And it wasn't just that, Frank. During his testimony, Bulger announced that John Morris had asked him to kill his wife because his wife wanted to get a divorce. Now, this is the same wife that has these organized crime figures coming home for dinner. She knows he's got money that can't be accounted for. And when you go through a divorce, you need to go through financials. And she's going to be asked about all the money they had. And there's a chance she might say, I have no idea how he came into this money. Or we had organized crime figures over all the time. So, according to Bulger, Morris came to him and asked him to kill the wife before they went through the financials. And Bulger this was announced in the trial, and Bulger told him, no, pay her more money. And, I mean, this stuff is outrageous. Now, we'll take it a little further with John Morris, okay? The heat was coming down on him as well in 1995. And he knew years prior he was up over his neck in all this. And he ran to the Boston Globe and told the Boston Globe that Bulger was an FBI informant. Now, Frank, an FBI agent is never, ever, ever supposed to identify an informant. Now, the Boston Globe journalist didn't take a step backwards and say, oh, my God, can't believe he's doing this. Why is he doing this? They knew the ethics of the whole situation. They didn't question it. They didn't investigate it. They didn't anything. They printed it. And this story became Black Mass. When I was done with that trial, and I started reading not only what was printed during the trial, but I started reading things from years ago, and I started reading all the books that were out there. I realized that these books were based on the testimony of the same individuals that 5 members of that jury didn't even think were telling the truth.
Wow. My
goodness.
goodness.
So this entire narrative came from their testimony.
Let me ask you about that informant aspect of Whitey Bulger's criminal history, because we've learned a great deal over these last few years about this so-called top echelon informant program where the FBI allows very serious criminals to remain at large committing very serious crimes. And people like, not only James Whitey Bulger, but Greg Scarpa and others have all been a part of this. As far as I understand, while it seems like Bulger's history as an FBI informant was well documented, and in some ways, this is one of the things people find most interesting about the aspect of Bulger's career, the fact that he could be working with and for the federal government and at the same time running this audacious criminal enterprise. And it's one of the key plot points in the movie The Departed, which obviously I know is fiction, but it does deal with some real life events, or at least the basis of real life events. My understanding is that during the trial, Bulger's defense never acknowledged that he was actually an FBI informant. Is that true?
That is true. In fact, they tried to show that he wasn't.
Why? Why do you think that's the case? Do you think they did that because of a street cred issue, Bulger not wanting to be labeled a rat? Is it because he wasn't an FBI informant? Was it some sort of a strategic thing? Tell me what you think.
Well, it's because he wasn't. Just like I just said, John Morris went to the Boston Globe and said he was. John Morris was brought before a judge, as were the journalists of the Boston Globe, Judge Nancy Gertner, and called on the carpet for it. And her take on it was that they wanted him to be murdered by either the mafia or his own gang members. And the truth of it was, none of them believed he was an informant. None of them murdered him, but the media kept going with it. You tell a lie long enough, it's believed, right? The media kept going with it. Bulger said he had no idea that they had an informant file that was supposed to be his until he was arrested and was told about this. If you watch the documentary, The United States of America versus James Bulger, they go into this in depth and the inaccuracies in the informant file. We also had, I believe it was 2 FBI agents who testified that Morris and Connolly were going into their informant files and lifting information out of them verbatim, but changing the date the information was given and the identity of the informant to Bulger. These guys testified to that. So, but of course, the media, this narrative has been there a long time, and the media has helped create it. So they are not going to step back and say, whoa, let's really look into what these 2 FBI agents just said. No. They're not going to change it. So we want to believe he was an informant, but Bulger, to his dying day, said he never was, that he bought information, he never sold anything to them, and he bought that information from Morris and Connolly to the tune of $500,000 each.
Americans love using their credit cards, the most secure and hassle-free way to pay. But D.C. politicians want to change that with the Durbin-Marshall credit card bill. This bill lets corporate megastores pick how your credit card is processed, allowing them to use untested payment networks that jeopardize your data security and rewards. Corporate megastores will make more money, and you pay the price. Tell Congress to guard your card, because Americans lose when politicians choose. Learn more at guardyourcard.com.
So the trial ends, Bulger gets convicted, goes to prison, and your jury service is over, but your involvement with Bulger in this case is far from over. You then begin a 5-year correspondence with Bulger. How did that come to be? What were you hoping to get out of a correspondence with Bulger?
I was hoping to have answers to the many questions that the trial raised, and the realization after the trial that all of the narrative was based on the testimony of these witnesses that 5 members of the jury didn't believe were telling the truth, and the realization, too, and the shock that none of these journalists had ever spoken to Bulger or corresponded with him. Now, as somebody who's written about American history, I know you have to go to primary sources. These guys never did. They took the word of these criminals that get out of going to the electric chair as their source of accurate information. That's a joke. So I got in touch with Jay Carney and Hank Brennan, the attorneys. Jay Carney told me he'd meet me in Boston for lunch. This was after the trial, but before sentencing. And I wish that I had taped our conversation, because from the moment we sat down, he was telling me about all the motions that were not allowed to come into the jury. And the first one was this: that when Bulger was arrested, and later when Carney and Brennan got the case, they brought it to the Boston U.S. Attorney's Office. Bulger wanted to plead guilty to all charges and take an expedited death sentence. And he did want something in return for that. What he wanted in return was leniency for his girlfriend, Catherine Gregg. Catherine had no priors. Catherine was not involved in criminal activity. She was a dental hygienist who taught dental hygiene in a college. And the Boston U.S. Attorney's Office turned that down. Now, mind you, part of the testimony in Bulger's trial was that the probation department had recommended 2 years for Catherine Gregg because Catherine had no priors. Now, that would have been leniency in Bulger's estimation, and he would have just gone and been executed. But no, Boston turned that down, and instead they ended up ultimately throwing 12 years at Catherine Gregg, the first year being in solitary confinement, and they insisted on this multi-million-dollar trial. Now I'm going to take you back again to Johnny Materano's girlfriend, who did the same exact thing and worse. 16 years on the lam covering up for him, money laundering and lying to a grand jury twice. She never stepped in a prison. Now, how does that weigh out in the system of justice?
Yeah, no, it's certainly a double standard, to say the least. So how would you describe the nature of your correspondence with Bulger? I saw that documentary you referenced a little while ago, United States versus Whitey Bulger, and Whitey does speak to the filmmakers in a couple of brief calls. He strikes me, just in that limited interaction that's chronicled in that documentary, as a difficult person to get to know, but it seems like you actually got to know him pretty well.
Oh, yeah, I think I did. He was complex for sure, but he wasn't a psychopath. He had a great deal of empathy and compassion for people. When we talked about his family, when we talked about my family, when we talked about animals, he was very easy to chat with, but you could see a difference, change in his countenance when we talked about his criminality. And he would tell me always, in letters and in person, Janet, don't ever forget I'm a criminal. He denied 4 of the murders, but he never denied the other murders. In fact, he told me about a murder we acquitted him of that he was in fact guilty of. And the only reason we acquitted him of it is because the prosecution only put this guy's name into the whole 10-week trial 2 times without giving us any information to make a decision on whatsoever. So, yeah, he was, I felt easy when we were just talking about normal things, not the criminality so much, to get to know. And, yeah.
For a guy that was as guilty as he was of multiple murders, why would the government need to rig anything? Why would they need to take any shortcuts when it seemed like getting, especially for an older man, getting a sentence that would involve him spending the rest of his life in prison wouldn't be too difficult?
Well, and part of this I want to back this up with, everybody will say, a lot of people say to me, well, he was the head of the Irish mob. He was the head of the gang. That's why they went after him. When they did their presentations in that trial, the prosecution, they had posters up. And on those posters, it had Bulger, Materano, and Flemmi all across the top of the posters, equals. And then they had the men that served each one of them listed under them. They never presented it as Bulger is the leader of this gang, okay? And even when Materano testified about a couple of murders he committed, he talked about having to go to Bulger and Flemmi to talk to them, that the 3 of them would make that decision in unison. So just that as a backdrop. Why could they take Flemmi and Materano and all the crimes they committed, all the murders they committed, which totally outweighed anything Bulger did, and focused solely on Bulger? And what I realized when we were began writing to one another, Bulger frequently put the time of day on his letters when he wrote them. And I noticed early on that it was 1, 2, 3 in the morning. So I asked him, why are you awake at this time? And his response made no sense to me. In fact, I thought he was a little loony maybe by his response. And he said, ever since MK Ultra, I can only sleep about 2 hours and I wake up wild animals attacking me. He's hallucinating this. So I asked him in the next letter, what is MK Ultra? This was never mentioned in his trial, and it wasn't mentioned in his trial because he told his attorneys not to bring it up. The background of it is that Bulger, well, we'll go a little bit more before I say that. So I began to look it up myself, waiting for his response, and found a lot of information and his name associated with some of it. And in a nutshell, it was a highly secretive CIA experiment in the 50s and 60s in which the CIA was trying to modify human behavior through the use of LSD. And everybody involved in this experimentation that it was being experimented on was lied to about what was happening. Therefore, they did not give permission for this to be done to them. Bulger was 26 years old when it was done to him. He was in prison for robbery. He had never killed anyone at this point. They came in and told the prisoners they were looking for volunteers to find a cure for schizophrenia. He had just finished up an experiment on a cure for whooping cough, and he volunteered for this. He said you'd get a little time off your sentence. You were treated better because you were tied in with the hospital department in the prison. And he said that many of the prisoners felt like they wanted to be part of society. And he said, like, who wouldn't want to help babies that were dying from whooping cough? So he and 8 others volunteered. For him, the experiment was done 3 times a week. He was given high doses of LSD. I've seen a portion of the prison hospital record, and this went on for 15 months. We know now that the human brain is not even fully developed until around 26. So when his brain was coming full development, they were putting this LSD into him for that long period of time. He said 2 of the prisoners were taken out stark raving mad. He didn't remember their names at first, then remembered their names. He said they never returned. He always wondered. I got in touch with the record departments of that particular prison to find out if those prisoners were actually there, and they were. I wasn't taking what he was telling me at face value. I was finding things to back it up. The only thing that saved Bulger from MK Ultra was he was transferred to Alcatraz. And if you look at his pictures of going into the Atlanta United States Penitentiary before he was put into this test, and his picture going into Alcatraz, it's just unbelievable, the difference, okay?
So go ahead.
Oh, he loved Alcatraz. He had nothing but good things to say about Alcatraz. And I was like, what? This is ridiculous. And then I realized it's what saved him from this experiment.
If you have the government loading him up with drugs for 15 months, and that preceded his violent criminal career, why would that not be something that the defense brought up in the trial? I would think that maybe that would give 1 or 2 jurors at the very least pause about convicting him for all these other crimes. Do you have any knowledge as to why they didn't even mention that?
He didn't make the connection himself. He thought that something must have been done to his brain, but he thought the effect was that he was sleep deprived for 60 years. He went to a doctor at one point, and the doctor kind of poo-pooed it. And so I think he thought, beyond the sleep deprivation, what could you prove or whatever? And it wasn't, and he told his attorneys not to bring it up. I know he did. He told me that, and I've talked to his attorneys about it, and they tell me they can't talk to me about it because
Do you think that would have changed the outcome of the trial?
For me, it absolutely would have. But see, he didn't get it at that point. When we started talking about his MK Ultra experiences, when I started looking into it myself and sharing information with him, and then what happened was in the late 60s, early 70s, the CIA had attempted to destroy all the records pertaining to it when they were being found out, but a small portion of records were found. And the United States Senate had a hearing on it in 1977. And in this hearing, which I finally got hold of, there's a new head of the CIA. His name is Admiral Turner. And Admiral Turner said right up front that they couldn't really give accurate numbers because most of the records were destroyed. But he estimated that it was done to 1,000 military personnel, that it was done in 44 colleges and universities, that it was done in 12 hospitals and in 3 prisons. Now, there was one question in the middle of this entire hearing by a Senator Huddleston from Kentucky. And Senator Huddleston asked Admiral Turner if there was a portion of this experimentation that was leaning toward making an individual violent or homicidal. And the answer was yes.
I can't say that I'm surprised, and I would think that this is very relevant to a jury in terms of evaluating someone's criminal career. So you mentioned that Bulger described hallucinations and nightmares stemming from these LSD experiments. It sounds like you do, but I'll ask the question just to be clear. Do you believe that these experiments fundamentally changed him as a person? And aside from the lack of sleep and the greater predilection towards violence, which is certainly significant enough, to what extent do you think they changed him as a person?
I think he already had the criminal background. Obviously, he was in prison already for robbery. But did it set him off on this other, what do you want to say, that he was created to be a killer? I mean, the Bourne Identity series is based on this stuff, And I think he may not have turned to murder had it not been done. But, of course, we can't say yay or nay on that, can we now that we know it?
Right.
Another person that was part of this experimentation was Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, as an undergrad at Harvard. He was only 17, and there have been a couple of connections made with Charles Manson out in San Francisco to a health clinic he was going to. Now, and that's not even it. You can take these guys, bad names, bad reputations, but let's take it a step further. There was a man who had been in the military and found out he was made part of this experimentation. He took his case all the way to the Supreme Court, and the attorney that was helping him with that is still out there practicing. Now, his reason for doing that was he would wake up every night hallucinating wild animals were attacking him. And when he came home, he beat up his wife and children all the time, and they left him. The Supreme Court turned this case down for matters of national security. So now take this out to the 1,000 men and women in the military who were made part of this experimentation without their knowledge or consent, and multiply it to their families today, which are still suffering. If that man his family was taken away from him and his kids were told they couldn't be around dad anymore because he went crazy, well, don't you think they have children now? Were those grandchildren allowed to be around grandpa? And you multiply that out by 1,000 individuals and their families today, and people are still impacted and they are still suffering from this today. And that was part of the reason Bulger was so upset when he realized what this experiment was about. And Bulger wanted to do a national interview in the last year of his life. He was determined. He was writing to 100 people worldwide, and he started writing about this stuff when he was figuring it and realizing it. And he actually, I know for a fact, he set up an interview or was in the process of setting up an interview with a New York Times journalist. And he wanted to talk about not only MK Ultra and what they had done to so many people. He wasn't going to get him out of prison. He had enough other crimes against him to keep him in prison for forever. He was also going to talk about the depth of criminality with Morris and Connolly, how much money he gave to them. Well, he was also ill. He had had 8 heart attacks while in prison. He was sent to the hospital 3 times for these heart attacks. He was on standing orders for nitroglycerin and oxygen. I am a nurse by profession. When I went to visit him, I could see his lower extremities. He had bilateral vascular insufficiency with weeping edema. The fluid was coming through his skin. Now being in a prison, when he had these hallucinations nightly, he's falling out of this small prison bed onto a concrete floor. He damaged his hips early on in our correspondence. I can show it. And it took them 4 months to even do an x-ray. And by that time, he was wheelchair bound. He could not walk. So you have a man who needs surgery not only on his hips, most likely, but also on his heart. And he's 89 years old. So they told him, meaning the BOP, that they were going to transfer him to a medical prison, and it was actually going to be Devon's here in Massachusetts. And in the midst of this transfer, and I'm talking about as it is occurring, the Bureau of Prisons announces that his health had suddenly improved, which was a blatant lie. And they sent him to West Virginia, which had a history of severe violence. New York Times journalists verified to me that the prisoners were told he was coming before the guards even knew it. He was sent there unguarded, even though 2 attempts had been made on his life in Florida, okay? He's sent there unguarded. Now, this is a guy that wanted to plead guilty and take the death sentence, and they rejected his offer to do that. So they were obligated to protect him. So they sent him there unguarded in general population. He's murdered within 8 hours. These 2 are seen going in and out of his cell on camera. They're not even indicted for 3.5 years. And I'm going to tell you this, the family was going after the Bureau of Prisons for not protecting him, and they threw that case out and then made the indictments against these guys just within a few days' time. That case was going into discovery. And when it goes into discovery, that means questions have to be answered. Who signed this transfer off? Where did this come from? Medical records, all of it. It was thrown out. Then they made their indictments. And the guys involved in his murder got a slap on the hand. Now, the question is this. This man was dying. It was a matter of months, probably less, when he would have the 9th heart attack. And he knew that, and he was prepared for that. But for some reason, that wasn't going to be fast enough, and he needed to die immediately. So the question is, who gave that order, and how far up the chain of command did it go? They didn't want him doing this national interview. I can assure you of that.
Imagine this. The best pasta sauce you have ever tasted sits abandoned on a plate. Wasted sauce. That is a tragedy. If only you had used Barilla al Bronzo pasta. Its bronze-cut texture holds your sauce and scoops up every last drop. The Italians call that scarpetta. Capture sauce the Italian way. Barilla al Bronzo. Click or tap the banner to find out more.
I want to follow up on a bunch of the things that you just said there. But going back to the fundamental point that Bulger didn't commit murder before being subjected to the LSD experiments, Do you think that that absolves him of any responsibility for the murders that he was convicted of, or is it a little bit more complex than that?
It's complex. It's like, did he or didn't he? I mean, I've told the Associated Press, they asked me what I would do if I was on the jury with this information. Well, I couldn't say he was guilty of the murders. I couldn't say he didn't. He committed them. He admits to committing them. But was he guilty of committing them, or was he programmed to commit them? Does he belong in a federal prison, or does he belong in an institution of some sort? For him, it would have been a federal prison because of all the other crimes. But look at Ted Kaczynski. Does he belong in the worst federal prison in the country, in solitary confinement? And I have been told he doesn't even see the light of day. Or does that man who was only 17 when they did this to him, does he belong in an institution of some sort and being treated with some kind of human decency?
Yeah, and a lot of folks were asking that same question about Kaczynski before he passed away last year. I think including his brother raised some similar things. Bulger often referred to himself as a master manipulator. Given your personal correspondence with him, do you ever worry that he may have manipulated you and that your perception of him through these letters may not be an accurate one?
He would always tell me, too, that he was a master manipulator. I always questioned that. I always questioned it. And like I said, I would check things out. I found pictures as far as the MK Ultra thing went, I would follow through and find other accounts of what he was telling me. As far as the murders go, I don't know. For instance, he told me he was never involved in the Wheeler and Callahan murders. And he went into great detail of if he had been involved in them, how he would have carried them out. And the same with the murders of the women that, he had no reason to be involved in those, he said. But I stepped away from that. And then he's denying these murders, but he's saying that, yeah, indeed, he did kill Buddy Leonard. Yeah. And he told me about another guy he killed, but I don't even know if anybody knows he killed him. So I'd walk away and think, weigh it out, balance it, see. And what does he have to gain from telling me any of that? Nobody's really going to believe it. I mean, he told it to me, but yeah.
In terms of the fundamental issue here, which is it seems like the government wanted him killed even while he was dying, what do you think they were hiding? Do you think they were hiding that they were not wanting to get more information about the CIA's history with MK Ultra out there? Or was there something more broadly unknown that they were afraid would come to light?
I think mainly it was probably the MK Ultra thing, to think that they were creating people that would go out and kill. How many did they create? I mean, we only know of 2 absolutely, involved in it, and a third potentially. How many more are out there that we don't even know about? And beyond that, if he was going to expose the FBI, even if it was just going to be Morris and Connolly, Morris went on with a full career. I mean, what does that say about the Boston FBI?
Right.
This guy is living on a full pension. And even the thing with Connolly, the reason they ended up throwing him in jail was absurd. It was absolutely absurd. And most people don't even understand what that was about.
You've talked about the level of health care or lack thereof that he received in prison. I've talked about, for the last 6 years, the horrific nature in which he was killed. And on the radio, whenever I bring this up, there's always many callers, not a few, but many callers, a lot of people that will write to me and say, good. Why should we care? This is a guy that hurt a lot of people, that ruined a lot of people's lives, that killed folks, and their families have to deal with the ramifications of Whitey Bulger's actions for the rest of their lives. Why should the public care that a violent criminal suffered a violent death? I'll pose that question to you. What do you say to those folks?
Well, I think first you have to step back and take in all the information. If he was created to be a killer, then was he responsible for those killings? And the other thing is, even the people, and I'm not justifying the killings in any way. I absolutely would not. But I have noticed that when anything comes up about Bulger, that at least back here in Massachusetts, there are two people that are always gone to by the media. One is Steve Davis, and another one is John Callahan's wife, who was killed by Martirano. Now, neither of these guys, both of their loved ones were killed by Martirano. Martirano is, in fact, or Fleming, were the ones that killed them, but they never mention Martirano or Fleming when they talk about their upset. They never mention that Martirano was leading a normal life in Medford, Massachusetts. You know, it's always Bulger, Bulger, Bulger. It's really, you almost step back and say, what the heck is going on here? Mm-hmm. But the other thing is, at least in the case of Callahan, John Callahan helped in the murder of Roger Wheeler, a businessman. John Callahan was embezzling from Roger Wheeler. John Callahan planned it along with Martirano to murder Roger Wheeler. John Callahan was not a good person. So if you want, let's compare all of them. Bulger killed within the criminal circle is what he said he did. So they're all evil. All of them are evil. But again, if you're going to think that this kid at the age of 26, that he was programmed to kill, then yeah, there is a vast difference here to the even comparing the man who killed him, the mafia hitman that killed him. You know, was the mafia hitman programmed to kill? Was John Martirano programmed to kill? We have nothing to indicate that whatsoever, but we do have information that indicates that Bulger was programmed to kill.
What did you make, Janet, of Bulger's claim that he believed he had immunity from prosecution? And do you think that belief was tied to the psychological effects of these LSD experiments?
No, he had, according to him, he had set up an agreement with Jeremiah O'Sullivan when O'Sullivan was bringing down the mafia. O'Sullivan, according to Bulger, came to him through a priest. They set up a meeting, and O'Sullivan asked Bulger if he would protect himself and his family from the mafia, if he and his gang would protect them from the mafia, and there would be, an agreement between them. Now, there is, from what I understand, a memo about that. It's about O'Sullivan's relationship with Bulger that was put under presidential seal in 2004. So we can't get at it to see what it says exactly. So that would have been under George W. Bush. Now, we also know that O'Sullivan died, I think it was like 15 months before Bulger was found. Sullivan's dead and can't testify to anything anymore. And even his death is has a big question mark around it. Okay. And then lo and behold, Sullivan's dead, and the FBI finds Bulger only 3 miles from headquarters in Los Angeles.
Yeah, I've always thought it sounded very suspicious and almost too strange to believe. Speaking of fiction, in your book, The Truth Be Damned, you've fictionalized some of your experiences with Bulger and the trial. What drove you to write this, and how much of the real Whitey Bulger is reflected in your story?
As far as Whitey Bulger being reflected, all of it that I, came to know him as. The reason I did it in that format was because I was counseled by an attorney to do it that way for my own safety. And it's actually written as a roman à clef, which means a novel with the key. It's a true story. Names are changed, but the vast majority of it is true.
Now you got to actually visit and meet with Bulger, right?
Yeah, 3 times.
And in your visits with him, how did his demeanor and his reflections on his life differ from what you saw during the trial? And did he ever express remorse for anything that he ever did?
He expects remorse for what he did to his family, and I think in the end he loved his family greatly. In the end, I think remorse for the life he chose, the life of a criminal. I remember at one point there were some girls in Massachusetts were doing a school paper on him and wrote to him, and he would write to almost anybody that wrote to him, and they wrote to him to ask him questions, and if crime paid was one of the questions. And his response to them was, yes, crime pays if you're a criminal attorney. So I think he regretted the lifestyle he had chosen in the end. And again, he would emphasize to me that as far as the murders and that type of thing went, it was all within the criminal realm, that he said he never bothered regular businessmen or like Roger Wheeler. That's why he objected to being connected to that. I mean, even stop and think about that murder. John Martirano had those guns shipped on a Greyhound bus. And that's what, Bulger would say to me. He's such an idiot. He was so high all the time that he didn't even consider that this was the most stupid thing in the world to do. So, and then he would go into great detail about how he would have got those guns out there and, and all of that, and why he never would have wanted to kill Roger Wheeler in the first place. So there's just so much beyond the narrative we've been fed in talking to him and actually going to the source and asking him the questions and sitting back and hearing the answers and then weighing it out. Is it true? Is it not true? Might it be true? Might it be true? And there's a whole other story here if you step away from the narrative that was started by the Boston Globe.
Right around the time that Bulger died, we also saw Jeffrey Epstein die in a federal prison. He purportedly killed himself. It's clear that you're somewhat suspicious of the circumstances around Bulger's death. A lot of folks always pointed to what happened with Epstein as well as an example of, at the very least, BOP incompetence and maybe something more, maybe some sort of malfeasance. Do you have a take on the Epstein death and the circumstances surrounding it?
Yeah, I think, as far as the BOP goes, they need a lot of improvement, but I think for both these deaths, they're being thrown under the bus. Epstein had an enormous amount of information that he could have traded off for his freedom. Enormous amount of names of important people that he could have traded off for his freedom. No, I don't think for a second he killed himself. Mm-mm.
I could talk to you forever, and I hope we can do a part 2 soon and continue the conversation. But there have been so many film and television depictions of Whitey Bulger. Obviously, I mentioned The Departed. You mentioned Black Mass. You have The Brotherhood, which deals with a fictionalized version of the relationship he had with his brother. He's been depicted as a version of Bulger has been depicted on shows like Ray Donovan. There's been all sorts of other episodes of popular culture that have depicted a Whitey Bulger type figure. As far as you can tell, of all the fictionalized portrayals of Whitey Bulger on the screen, be it television or film, what's the most accurate?
I don't watch them, to be truthful. I never had an interest in organized crime, and I still do not. I'm just telling what I found out from the source and putting it against other information and evidence. I will tell you this, though. Whitey Bulger, at least in Massachusetts, is depicted as the monster. They actually even refer to him as the monster. Why isn't John Martirano referred to as a monster? He killed 2 children. Why isn't Steve Flemmi referred to as a monster? There are no negative connotations to their names whatsoever. So what the heck is that all about?
Yeah, you raise such an interesting point. All right, I've been talking with Janet Uhlar. You can check out her book, Truth Be Damned. Also, a lot of other great work, whether you're interested in the criminal justice system, the American Revolution, or anything else. Janet, thank you so much.
You are very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. If you want to comment on any portion of our conversation, you can email me. My email is frank.morano@wabcradio.com. That's frank.morano @wabcradio.com. If someone sent you this podcast, please do us a favor and share it with somebody that you think may be interested in it. And please be sure to subscribe. You can just search The Racket Report on any podcast app, and whenever there's a new episode uploaded, it will come right to your phone or wireless device. Until the next time we meet in cyberspace, I'll see you on the radio.